I'm Duncan McLeod, and this is the TechCentral Show. You can subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/TechCentral. Now, TCS is brought to you by MTN Business. Learn more about MTN Business and its solutions by visiting mtnbusiness.co.za. And we thank them for partnering with us to bring you these great interviews. And we have a great interview in the studio next. Solly Malatsi is the relatively newly appointed Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies. Mr. Malatsi, welcome to TechCentral, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we could find the time.
Great. You've been in the job for 3 months now. You've had an opportunity to chat to the major players in the ICT ecosystem. What is your initial thoughts on the role and the people you've met and the challenge ahead of you?
Look, I think the instant discovery from the initial stakeholder engagement, whether it was both internally and externally, indicated a couple of things. One was, the level of unease around policy uncertainty in the environment, and the other was also an opportunity in terms of how do we then look at a different approach to regulation in that we balance the opportunities that are there in every regulation to align, for me in particularly as a newly appointed minister, to align with two key things. One being, the GNU statement of intent, which has amongst its priorities fostering inclusive growth and job creation. And then secondly, from that, aligning with the ministerial priorities, which are quite basically simple. How do we get more South Africans connected to the internet? How do we get, reliable broadband and other options of infrastructure that empower the most vulnerable and poor South Africans in remote areas, also being digitally, connected from handheld devices, and making sure that smart devices are also affordable, and having a sense of ownership. I think, it is quite obvious that because this industry is highly contested, because every policy intervention, has immense implications on the status quo and also the future. There's been a high level of, litigation within the sector, and that emerges from probably, policy ambiguity, policy uncertainty. And I think those are opportunities that when you have a whole of society approach to decision making, you can have a different outcome. Of course, it's much easier said and done, but at least there's got to be an effort of pulling around everyone. And secondly, making interventions that are based on, evidence-based research so that we produce credible outcomes. And then secondly, to the sector, there's got to be also, ownership, that when you're part of a process of collaboration or contributing towards an outcome, that outcome has to be owned. I don't think it is practical in every sphere of life that, every individual or every sector will always get whatever it wants. But I think we must always approach our roles to say, how do we, from the mobile network operators to, the regulator, to the ministry, and to even the media platforms, how do we play a contribution that helps this sector succeed and unlock the potential that it has? As I said, in getting South Africans connected, but also in being a significant contributor towards attracting investment that create jobs. And that's, for me, is my singular obsession.
Investment.
Yeah, investment that, translates into jobs, but also improves the quality of life for people. Can you imagine if we're able to get, every South African connected from their household? How incredible that would be in unlocking opportunities, not just for learning, convenient learning, but also entrepreneurship, and what that could do to young people, because even the future of economic activity lies in livelihoods. The public sector is never going to absorb every young person who is in need of a job, right? But every person wants a livelihood, whether that is through a job or starting their own business. They want the means that will be able to empower them to put bread on the table. And connectivity can unlock, that if data is more affordable, if smart devices are more affordable. And that's why I've engaged in, a process of advocacy around that, because when you remove the luxury tax associated with smart devices, it's incredible how much that price of smart devices drops. And to this end, we are working with act in here to see what impact would it have in terms of lowering the cost, because the key thing that we want to do is, one, look at regulation in a way that makes it an opportunity to attract investment. Secondly, look at what are the barriers to accessibility and remove that, so that more poor people, and you'll find out those are mostly Black, poor South Africans,
sure,
can have more reliable access to the internet and can have, access to affordable devices, which then means that they can leverage those. In this day and age, a smart device is not a luxury. It's a basic is a basic essential that we live by. You do your bank transactions on your phone. 2G devices, some of them don't do that. But if the cost is lower, more people can afford them, right? Then it then drives traffic, and the benefits of that trickle into the economy, trickle into education.
I think you mentioned that you were going to have a meeting with the Minister of Finance to talk about some of these issues. Have you had that meeting yet? Has the National Treasury been receptive to the idea of cutting taxes on smartphone imports?
Well, look, I don't want to prematurely impact on that, but the discussion had already been there. I think it's there is a recognition that one of the most obvious barriers you can remove towards making smart devices affordable is the ad valorem tax on smart devices. And we are engaging with Treasury on that, but ultimately, to action that, there's got to be a team formed particularly to look at. But we want to present something to Treasury first, which is, the study that we've commissioned to say these are the benefits, and based on, expert consultation and based on credible evidence, this is what we are presenting. Yeah.
You've spoken about making technology more accessible to all South Africans. What do you believe is the role of the state in doing that? Should the state be invested in the sector itself, or should the state's role simply be to set the policy that allows the private sector to compete, drive down prices, and provide that access? What is your view on that? Well,
the state has an important role. It has to be very clear in the type of policy that it sets out. But the state has to create a conducive environment, right? The conducive environment is created by the right policies that strike several balances. One being that there's got to be fair competition in the market. There's got to be basic compliance, because it can't just be a free for all, right? You need very basic compliance aspect so that everybody applies with. And there's got to be a recognition that in doing so, don't suffocate, the players that are in existence and contributing into the economy. I mean, the ICT sector is a massive contributor towards our economy, and increasingly going into the future, it will probably be one of the biggest contributors, if not the biggest, right? So the policy has got to take even the evolution of technology into place and be much more agile in responding to innovation, because unfortunately we're in a sector that is constantly evolving.
Okay. The reason I ask that is government is still a big player in the sector. It's a 40.5% shareholder in Telkom. It obviously owns Sentech as well. There's Broadband Infraco in the fiber space. Should the state be invested in all of these state-owned enterprises? Is there still a strategic reason for the government to be a significant shareholder, for example, in Telkom?
Well, I think there's still a need for government to play its role in some of these entities. The key thing is beyond that role, right? Is the sustainability and the health of all these entities. Because the fundamental question lies on some of them, being solely dependent on the fiscus for revenue for their basic functioning, but some of these entities, are run very well, and we have to be fair in acknowledging that. And some of them have actually played a very key role in making sure that the sector has the necessary support it needs to thrive. But I do think when you look at the future of the state in there, is that the state's got to be a facilitator of set the policy and choose the right policies. Then the other questions about the size of its involvement and all of that, become secondary issues. Because every entity is different, and its performance, its individual performance must guide the question about the level of the state's involvement in it.
Okay. To ask you directly though, Telkom, the government's 40% stake in Telkom, does that stay for now?
That stays for now, yeah.
Okay. Right, you were in New York last week for a United Nations event. The president was also there. He met with Elon Musk. I believe you've had engagements in South Africa with representatives from Starlink. You say you're passionate about investment. Why is it taking Starlink so long to launch in South Africa? What have they told you?
Well, I think you'll have to ask that question to Starlink. Our engagement was, as a minister in this portfolio, one is obsessed with looking at opportunities that can get more South Africans connected. It's very clear that based on the depth of the current broadband infrastructure, there are so many South Africans that are excluded. So you can't be obsessed about the future of getting South Africans, connected and not think about other alternative ways that can help bridge, the digital divide. I don't like using that. It's become such a cliche, but it's about getting more South Africans, connected with devices in their hands and not think about, how low orbit, satellites are going to play a role in the sector. So the meeting was introductory in trying to understand what their plans are about involvement in the South African market, and to also get, because there just been so much, questions about has there been a formal approach, to
Icasa.
the department previously and all of that. And I think it wasn't in isolation to broader efforts of engaging with, even the mobile network operators and every key player in the sector, in order to make wise and the right decisions and considerations about what's necessary for the sector. You have to engage, all potential players and existing players in order to be able to get to the right decisions.
Okay. There's been some speculation, and I must admit Starlink hasn't confirmed or denied that this is the reason it's taken so long to launch here, but there's been a lot of noise about South Africa's BEE rules around licensing of entities by Icasa, specifically around the equity requirements that Icasa mandates on licensees. We know the DA's views, and you're a member of the Democratic Alliance. We know the DA's views on BEE are quite different to the ANC's views. Do you believe that the rules that apply for BEE in this sector are an impediment to investment at all?
Well, I think we have to look at it broader and not do the extrapolation that you're attempting to do. The bottom line is that regulations currently, as they are, have certain requirements that make it difficult for multinationals to come and invest in our sector and play a role. And there are other options that are at play that can be considered. Some of those including, the question that needs to be clarified around, equity ownership schemes, for instance, and having that clarity would be useful going forward. And these are all the considerations. I think ultimately, the question is gotta be about, in the space that we are in, with recognition of all, the legislation that is in place. Where is the room for innovation to take place to address the biggest challenge that South Africa faces, that we've got millions of poor South Africans who are in rural areas who are not connected to the internet, and let that be the guiding light to getting to the decision. But it is key not to create, exemptions for specific players, because there's gotta be fairness in the market. And when you speak about fairness, it's gotta be about healthy competition. So all the other, aspects that are applicable to existing players should be applicable across the board.
Fairly to everybody.
Yeah.
Okay. But what is your view on BEE in the sector? Do there need to be changes in the licensing regime specifically to encourage foreign investors to come into this market?
Look, I think we need to look at, two key things. How we, for instance, incorporate the sustainable development goals into the considerations, right? And let that be the guide. I think the frustration around the question of BEE broadly in society is the sense and the genuine sense in society that it hasn't produced the outputs that it was intended. When you look at legislation, and I think this for your audience is something that they are obsessed with, but I think the key thing from any ministry is you have to find solutions, right? And in finding solutions, you have to be obsessed with finding solutions that are then fair to the rest of society or the rest of the sector in applying applying them. And I'm one never to be, too obsessed with, what hasn't what's bringing progress down, but saying that from the constraints that are there, what are the interventions that we have never thought about before that we can test, and see out what the response is.
Okay. I want to turn to the post office now because you issued a statement earlier this week in which you expressed your intentions to seek private investors to try and avoid another taxpayer-funded bailout of the post office. First of all, why do you believe the post office...
We didn't use those words.
Okay, I'll allow you to correct what I said. But why do you believe the post office is even worth saving?
Well, the post office is important because it has the largest footprint of probably any service delivery outlet in the country. Despite the closure of, many of its branches in the last few years, I think just in terms of universal access, and its proximity to again poor South Africans, and mostly its proximity in terms of access to social grant beneficiaries, there is room for the post office to exist, so that people who are not of an economic status, let me rephrase that, so that or people who do not have the means, to use other alternative forms other than the post office, that remains accessible to them. The key question, that is a fair question, is how in a market that has evolved, that has become highly digitized, that has become highly competitive, how do you reposition the post office, to be a competitive player in this space, leveraging its advantage that it has, which is, the geographic spread that I spoke about, the accessibility. You ask every South African, I think at one stage in our life, probably within a 5-kilometer radius, there was a post office branch. And the level of activity that happened there was an indicator that it's a resource that can be used by people. And even the mushrooming, for instance, of the new players that have entered into the postal and more so the courier services market is an indicator to you that the market exists, and it's about how the post office leverages all its facilities to be, the postal and courier of choice for the South African public. And more importantly, that it is financially sustainable, because that is the big question. The big question is around repositioning so that in the future it is financially sustainable. If you look in previous years, how many times the state has come to the rescue of the post office financially, it is not a beautiful picture, right? And I think the key thing here is that the resources that go into sustaining state-owned enterprises means that some money is being taken away from either, health, education, policing, which are called basic, services that affect the well-being of society in general, right? And I think Treasury has the figures are outstanding, that they can show you the amount that they've, spent on bailouts. But what we are saying is that it is important that in the immediate, right, there is accountability for previous commitments, that Treasury, previous allocations that Treasury has allocated to the post office. And that while we grapple with the question of its repositioning into the future, it is quite clear that that future requires consideration of private partners in order to relieve it being completely dependent on the fiscus, because that path is unsustainable going into the future.
Okay, let's get an understanding then of exactly what you mean. The phrase you used in the statement that you issued was privatization scenarios.
Yeah.
Just explain what you mean by that. Are you looking to bring in private investors for parts of the post office's business? Are you looking for a strategic investor to take, say, a 30 or 40% stake in the entire entity? What's your thinking?
So the thinking is that one will form a team with Treasury, that one looks at the most important thing with the consideration of, private partners, that we can look at operational and also, private partnerships, because as I said, the existing infrastructure that the post office has is a major advantage, right? The mandate it has around universal access is a very powerful mandate, that if it was functioning well and it was operationally efficient, and I think that's what we want to get to it, it will be the preferred choice for members of the public. But you gotta suss out the appetite from the private sector in terms of playing a role, and then define that role. And that's where we are saying that the path is quite clear based on our assessment right now and looking into the past, that, the future requires that you, at the very least, consider these different scenarios, because it would be naive not to, given its current health.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about broadcasting. The SABC and Sentech have been at war with each other for several years now over the fees that Sentech charges the SABC for signal distribution. I know the battle has gotten pretty ugly, and it's ended up at the competition authorities. I believe that you're seeking some sort of arbitration process to try to resolve the dispute between the parties. Where do we stand at the moment? And allied to that, what do you see as the future of Sentech?
Well, so one of the first things that confronted me when I arrived was this particular dispute between the SABC and Sentech regarding, the historic bill, and I think also into, the quantum for the licensing. And I thought for two entities that are under one department to be involved in a litigious battle just doesn't sound right. So we have attempted to set a mediation process. That mediation process is almost ready to kick off, and the engagements one has had with both the leadership of Sentech and SABC at a board level is to try and get and resolve this, because to have a protracted legal deadlock over this is not, is not in the best interest of everyone, because every cent that we spend in that protracted legal battle could be generated towards, helping both entities spend their resources better. And I don't think that the best way to do that is to be stuck in a legal battle. But the reception from the two entities has been really amazing, because there's a commitment to getting that resolved. On your question regarding the future of Sentech, look, I think Sentech is still going to continue to play an important role. We have to look at the future, for instance, of community media, and its ability to sustain itself, because when you look at the level of community radio stations that are closing because they can't afford their licensing and compliance, that's a major source of concern, just in terms of accessibility to news, and accessibility to internet. But I think another thing that you'd probably be aware of is that from, I think it's the early days of the sixth administration, there was a push towards, trying to reduce the number of state-owned entities that are in existence and try and merge some that had duplicate mandates or that would make sense for some to work together. And Broadband in Franco, for instance, was one of those that together with Sentech were identified. No, I think I'm mixing up things.
No, you're right. It was Broadband in Sentech.
Yeah. Oh, the other one was Icasa and Yusuf. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So it was Broadband in Franco and Sentech. And I'm very clear in that, we need to move with speed over making sure that happens.
Do you think that deal makes sense?
Yeah, I think that deal makes sense.
Why? One's a fiber operator, the other's a broadcast signal distributor.
Yeah, look, I think they can find itself not just operationally, but in terms of the mandate, because we're just having a series of entities that, if you clearly reconcile what they are doing, the compatibility is there, for them to function together.
Okay.
Yeah.
The SABC, it's also facing tough financial conditions, potentially needing another bailout. How do you fix the SABC? I mean, they've got a huge issue with TV license collection. No one wants to pay the TV license. I think compliance is sitting around 10 or 12%. They're under pressure from commercial operators. Their share of the advertising pie has shrunk. What's the future for the SABC? Does it need to be reduced in size, do you think? Do you think some of its assets perhaps need to be sold and it becomes more of a focused public broadcaster? And how is it funded in future?
Look, I think that's a question that needs, even us to properly apply our minds to. And it's one that we haven't had the final answer in terms of, what the future looks like. But again, the key thing that will inform the decision is there is space for a public broadcaster, right? That's indisputable to exist. The question really is, how do you provide support for the public broadcaster to be able to carry its free to carry mandate while fulfilling its commercial ambitions and being competitive in the sector. Because again, like with the post office, the audience level, the reach, the accessibility that it has is a powerful opportunity and a powerful resource. And I think when you look at some of the historic decisions that the SABC has taken in the past, they have not helped it in being in a space where it's competitive. But I'm really encouraged that as a new minister getting in, the SABC has a fairly new leadership also that has gotten in. Reflected in the board and in the management with the CEO, and one has a sense that it has the right leadership to be able to steer it in the right direction, and that while we're trying to find the right answers about the future of its funding, one thing is very clear is that part of that answer means not being solely dependent on the fiscus. And the secondary part of that answer also means the SABC being financially sustainable to be able to be competitive in this market that is constantly becoming tough for every player, whether a public broadcaster or a private one.
So you believe the SABC should fund itself through commercial operations? It shouldn't be purely a public broadcaster funded entirely from the fiscus?
Look, there can be provision for the fiscus, but it can't be wholly dependent on the fiscus. It's unhealthy if it's wholly dependent on the fiscus, because what happens when the fiscus is not? What will happen when the day comes that the fiscus is not able to sustain it, right?
Which it's struggling to do
exactly
right now. What about a household levy? The SABC has lobbied for the possibility of a household levy to replace TV licenses. Effectively, I think people are going to see that as another tax. Is it something you'd entertain?
Well, I see you're being naughty here. Look, that's why I say we need to think properly about the funding model for the SABC, and how that funding model is going to be practical, and how that funding model is going to be sustainable. And I think, despite my preliminary thoughts on the household levy, I think it's important to do much more thorough brainstorming of it, and not have a moment of blood rushing to the head kind of like response to these very important conversations, because they're about the future. No, it's not even about time. It's about due consideration. It's about due consideration of what is ultimately in the best interest of the SABC and the South African public. And the reality is that when you look broadly at the cost of living in the country, South Africans are already overburdened. So whatever consideration you make has to also be informed by that. Yeah.
Okay. Just staying on TV for a moment longer, the digital TV migration, I think I started writing about this when I was a young man. It's been going on for about 20 years now, and still no end in sight. You've obviously been briefed on where we are with digital migration. How do you want to see this proceed going forward? And do you believe there's even a need for terrestrial television anymore, given how technology is advancing in the era of satellite and streaming?
Look, I think we haven't moved with the pace that we should have moved with, and I think there's broad recognition that we haven't moved fast enough to be able to transition wholly into digital. And the most important question that we have to deal with is, when we haven't moved with the speed that we shouldn't have to meet our own targets, to be able to fulfill our own commitments, what is the right course of action to take? Because we would not have credibility, for instance, to demand other role players to deliver on their mandates if we don't deliver on our own commitments, right? So I think the reality is that there are still large portions of the country that rely on terrestrial, right? And you have to recognize that if you move haphazardly, while we haven't we haven't moved to fulfill our own commitments in that area, you're going to end up excluding many poor South Africans from being able to access television, for being able to enjoy the same things that you and I would be able to do, because we have transitioned to digital. So for me, is every decision that we take has got to be, its consequences and impact cannot exclude, poor South Africans who do not have alternative means that any other part of the population would have.
Okay, so there's a role for terrestrial television, at least for the next little while.
Look, the reality is there are still large numbers of South Africans who rely on it. And until we have transitioned them, where do you expect those people to then enjoy, access to television?
Yeah. I'm thinking specifically of things like OpenView, which is a free-to-air satellite platform.
Yeah.
Maybe there's an opportunity for the SABC to deliver its services via a similar sort of model.
And I'm saying right now, what do you do with those individuals?
Yeah.
Right. Because if you were to clinically, follow what your question seeks to your previous question seeks to achieve, you'll end up having millions of South Africans who just wake up tomorrow and not have access to their television. And I think that would be ruthless to do, given that even our infrastructure hasn't transitioned to that level.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Allied to the broadcasting migration is also the move to potentially switch off 2G and 3G networks in South Africa. I know your predecessor set a deadline, which I think was retracted. And I know that ACT, or the Association of Comms and Technology, has been lobbying hard to say that there shouldn't be a deadline imposed. Let the operators decide when the most appropriate time is to switch off these networks. Certainly encourage us to do it, but let us set the appropriate time to do that. What's your view on this? Should the government be telling the operators that they need to switch off 2G and 3G by a certain date, or should it be left to commercial imperatives?
Look, I think it has to be guided by evidence-based research. You can't take the approach that, no, you shouldn't take the decision. It has to be based on what does the most credible evidence say is the right decision to do. And I've engaged, with ACT, and I've engaged also with the department trying to understand what would be, the best way to deal with this. The reality is you still have a high volume of 2G and 3G devices that are in the hands of many poor South Africans, and I think it goes back to the very beginning, right? If you have more South Africans transitioning from 2G, 3G devices to 4G and 5G devices, then you'll be able to make the assessment and say, what is the right decision to do? But for me, it's got to be informed by, thorough assessment of what the right decision is. Mm-hmm. It's not about who makes the decision. It's about what is the evidence that guides the decision. And it's something that I've been applying my mind to.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'd like to just spend a minute on the state IT agency, which also falls under your portfolio. It used to be under DPSA, but it was moved a few years ago to communications. Now, there was a recent court ruling against your predecessor, Mondli Gungubele, regarding the SETA board. The court, in fact, your predecessor dismissed the previous SETA board, and the courts have ordered that the board be reinstated. What is the current situation at SETA regarding the board, and how are you dealing with the court judgment?
The board has been reinstated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you happy with the current board?
The reinstated board?
The reinstated board, yeah.
I mean, they've just been reinstated for less than 3 weeks.
Okay.
So we let their work speak for itself, and that will inform, my reaction to their performance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. And the state IT agency, more broadly, in terms of its positioning in the market and the services it provides, do you see a need for change there?
What do you mean by change?
Does it need a new mandate? Does it need to do things differently? Is it positioned correctly?
Well, I do think it needs to do things differently because, both inside government, there's a level of frustration with the inefficiencies that are a result of, solely relying on SETA as the source of IT infrastructure procurement. And that indicates the level of frustration in government. You can imagine the level of frustration outside government through members of the public's experience with different entities, and I think it's not even cliche to hear that the system is offline, whenever you go to some of these government entities and all of that. And it's not even, something to joke about, but it's become so common that it's a disruptive element to a lot of, citizens' lives who, whether it's, going to Home Affairs and then not being able to get the kind of help that you need because the system went down, or, whether it's going to the Department of Labor through the entity that does the UIF, and you're not able to access that because the system is down. I think addressing the operational inefficiencies will be so crucial to SETA's role, particularly in driving this whole program or ambition with digitization of government services. And I mean, Duncan, this has just been under 3 months in the role,
Sure.
and one is grappling with, very, very complex matters that don't have, not all of them have immediate answers, right? But all of them require relooking at them, and saying, where is the room here for making, impactful interventions that can allow us to get the results that we need.
We are almost out of time, but let me ask you this question last, and maybe you can answer it in the context of some of the legislative changes that are in the works. I know that from the previous administration, there have been a number of legislative processes underway. The audiovisual bill. I forget the full name of it. There were plans to amend the Electronic Communications Act. So maybe you could just touch on those as well in answering this question. But let's assume you serve the full 5-year term in the GNU up to 2029, the next general election. How will you determine your success? Looking back in 2029, how will you say to yourself, well, I've actually done a good job here? What will you have achieved in the portfolio?
Getting more South Africans connected from their households, having smart devices being cheaper for more South Africans to access, having data costs being more affordable for more South Africans, having entities that have solid good governance structures and are being led well, and making sure that there's healthy market competition in the industry, and making sure that, you know, we have a fair balance of sustainable infrastructure that allows this sector to thrive, and that most importantly we've got policy certainty that has led to investment that have created jobs in this area, and for me that will be the most important aspect, that every intervention has contributed towards, you know, getting more South Africans connected. Every intervention has led towards, you know, smart devices being affordable to more South Africans, which means that more and more poor people will be able to leverage the power of the ICT sector to pursue either opportunities for learning, opportunities for forming their own businesses, or even opportunities for entertainment. Right? That for me will be the baseline for success. And just coming back to your question, I think in terms of legislation, I think what the approach that I've taken is to say, let me try and understand what was, you know, the logic that informed the intention to, you know, pursue this legislation, and what has been the feedback about, you know, some of this legislation, as early as some of it is. And what does the feedback tell us about how to improve the legislation and make it better so that it's inclusive of all the areas of concerns of society? Because for legislation, for me, to be able to unlock the power of opportunities for success, it's got to be credible, right? It's got to have ownership of the sector, and the process towards that formulation has to be inclusive, and that's what will ultimately determine my final posture towards every piece of that legislation.
I thank you for engaging with TechCentral and for coming into our studio. Solly Malatsi is the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies. I thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to future engagements.
Thank you. We'll always make time.